When you're talking to your family members, I always encourage people to talk about your own thoughts and opinions for yourself. Let's say you're trying to talk to someone, your parents. They can get kind of defensive, like what you're saying, I'm old, or you want me to die, or like all of the things. But if you say, I've been thinking about myself, or I just completed my advanced directive and I wanted to talk to you about it, and then that leads to, well, have you completed your advanced directive, or do you know where it is, Dad? So that it's not just about the other person. It's also like we're vulnerable too, because we're all going to die. So we don't want to necessarily stare at someone intently and say, hey, what are your thoughts
Mm.
on this, if we're not willing to talk about it ourselves.
Welcome to the Inheritance of Hope podcast. Every day, 562 children lose a parent to terminal illness. They shouldn't have to face that alone. You can pretend to avoid the painful realities of illness, grief, and death, or you can deal with the real stuff in caring community. On the podcast, people in Inheritance of Hope's community share raw, personal stories of pain, trials, and the shadow of death, which are also stories of joy in terminal illness. Find more Inheritance of Hope community at inheritanceofhope.org. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to this week's episode of the Inheritance of Hope podcast. My name is Ellie, and I'm the host, and I'm joined with a special guest to walk us through creative ways to start conversations about end of life. I know it sounds like a very fun episode. A lot of us are not comfortable with thinking or talking about mortality, but the reality is we all will come into different seasons of our life where we will have to face mortality and the realities of illness and grief and death. So how can we best equip ourselves and our families to engage in this topic in a meaningful way, especially when we're kind of out of that season? I think that's the best time to start talking about it, because when we're in a season where we directly have to face it, we're already swamped with so many other things and the emotional burden is so much heavier. So our guest is going to walk us through how to engage in this in a way that makes it more playful, more lighthearted, and more approachable in general. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about who you are and your background.
Thanks for having me, Ellie. My name's Lisa Paul. I am a licensed clinical social worker residing in Los Angeles, and I come from a background of hospice social work. I've been in that position for almost 20 years, and then also emergency medicine. And in both of those settings, I have found that people aren't having these conversations. And so what that leads to is often um, chaos, confusion, and conflict between family members when we are then put in a position of making decisions for someone else. And so what talking about these topics can do ahead of time, or as you said, Ellie, kind of in between seasons, is that we can approach the topic with more of a preparation and conversation mentality, instead of when we're facing a serious illness or someone we love is facing a serious illness. The emotions are so high. The competing topics are so high, whether it's
Mm.
treatment, symptom management, caregiving, all of these factors. It's really hard to then have meaningful conversations when all of those things are happening. So it's always best if we can have them before or between those times.
Yeah, I was on a different podcast and we were talking about legacy, building, and kind of what are ways that we can engage in these topics before we need to, essentially. And one analogy that popped in my head as I was on that podcast, and it's really stuck with me, is it feels like every time we have a conversation like this, every time for our Inheritance of Hope families or anyone listening, like anytime we make a legacy video for our family or make a legacy song or do these things, we are lighting a candle along the way. you don't feel the need to have candles lit in a bright room. But as soon as the lights go off and the darkness sets in, then you realize, oh man, I need candles. I need to see what's happening. And when we light those candles along the way, whenever the darkness hits, whenever the lights go out, we already have the stage set because we've done the intentional prep work. And so I love that concept and that idea, and I think it fits so well into what we're going to be talking about today. Um, but I think the format is kind of what we need to talk about because obviously people could probably see the importance of it, but how do we actually start lighting those candles? How do we actually start bringing up what we want as we're dying and how we want our family to come together? So, what suggestions do you have to start lighting those candles and having those conversations?
I have a lot of suggestions. The first is we can use opportunities in our personal lives to bring up the topic with our family members. So, as an example, my parents live in northern Michigan, and they've had most of their neighbors for their whole lives. And one of their neighbors recently had a stroke and was in the hospital. And the family decided to place a feeding tube, and my parents' neighbor was going to be transferred to a long-term care facility. I was talking to my dad, and I asked how the neighbor was doing, and he kind of shared that. And so I said to him, well, what do you think about that?
Mm.
He was just presenting the facts. And so then I said, what do you think about that? And he said, well, if you ever do that to me, I'm going to haunt you. He's got a pretty good sense of humor, but he was serious. And so we had a pretty rich discussion. He would have rather not had the feeding tube placed and focused on comfort measures at that time. So we can use examples in our life to then say what we think about it, which then invites the other person to share or to ask them, what are your thoughts on this? We can also use the media. My mom and I watched This Is Us at the same
Mm.
time, and they have a really beautiful segment about when Rebecca is diagnosed with dementia. She does an advanced directive and she talks to her family about her wishes. And so that became a really wonderful entry point to having a conversation with my mom. The Pit is now on and really hot. And unfortunately, it's not network TV, but it at least gives so many opportunities for conversations. There's so many different patients that come in with different situations that can be springboards for talking about like what would you want in that situation. And then the most fun way is the tools that I've developed with
Mhm.
with the Death Deck, my company, to basically provide card decks that are like games to help people talk through what they would want in different situations. And so we have the Death Deck, which has a skull on it, which this is a deck that is definitely between seasons or before a medical crisis or a terminal diagnosis, because we use a lot of humor in it.
Mm.
Mm. The reason for that is because this topic is one that people don't want to talk about. So using humor and multiple choice questions allows it to be a little bit easier. And we have a wide range of topic questions. So they're not just about like what you want as you're dying, but it's more about all of your thoughts on death and dying in the afterlife and all of these really rich topics um, that we all have opinions about. We're just don't have practice talking about.
Mhm.
And then we created the end of life deck, which is specifically for people with serious illness. It's to talk through, as you said at the top of this episode, is what you would want as you were dying. And that's what this deck is. It asks about how do you feel about visitors as you're approaching end of life? How do you feel about touch? Who's okay to touch you?
Mm.
What would you like to be focusing on? What would you like to be hearing in your final days? So it helps empower people to have more say in their
Mm.
own experience, as well as reduce that friction between family members because we're following someone's wishes rather than making decisions for them, you know?
Mhm.
And then lastly, I created the dementia deck. And this one's a little bit different. It's specifically looking at the type of care and treatment you would want if you're living with dementia. The reason for that being that people often live with dementia for 10 years or more, and family members are faced with a lot of different decisional moments and don't know what to do. So all three of these tools are ways to approach the topic with a little bit more structure because you have someone else
Mhm.
asking the question, the card is. But also with a little bit more of a lightness than I think we typically perceive there being within these conversations. And we don't make fun,
Mhm.
but it's more, how do we make this palatable? How do we get people to talk without being so fearful? And that's really what I try to do is just help people have these conversations.
It really is an incredible approach because it's such a daunting thing. And it reminds me of a reason that art therapy is so impactful and can be so transformative is because for a lot of people, going to a counselor's office and sitting across from someone making eye contact, that's not an approachable way to handle things. But with art therapy, I'm not looking at you. I'm looking down at my paper or I'm sculpting with clay and my focus is on this third element. And in the process of that, it's easier to talk because it removes that directness that can be so intimidating for all of us as humans. And so having a conversation about death might not be as successful when you just go over to your parents' house or whoever and you sit down and say, what do you want in your last days? Or how do you want to die? Oh, my word, that's so jarring. And I don't think that would be as successful for most people. However, when you have that third element of, oh, we're watching the show together, what do you think about that? It's so much easier. And the deck of cards is just phenomenal. I love that idea.
Thank you. I like your point. It is really hard, with the end of life deck, and I have used it quite a bit with my hospice patients, but having that card in your hand, it creates this third thing. It's like a little barrier between
Mhm.
the patient and myself. And so there's a little less vulnerability
Mhm.
because there's something else to focus on. When you're talking to your family members, I always encourage people to talk about your own thoughts and opinions for yourself. Let's say you're trying to talk to someone, your parents. They can get kind of defensive, like what you're saying, I'm old, or you want me to die, or like
Mm.
all of the things. But if you say, I've been thinking about myself, or I just completed my advanced directive and I wanted to talk to you about it, and then that leads to, well, have you completed your advanced directive or do you know where it is, Dad? So that it's not just about the other person. It's also like we're vulnerable too. We don't know when we will die because we're all going to die. So we don't want to necessarily stare at someone intently and say, hey, what are your thoughts
Mm.
on this if we're not willing to talk about it ourselves? These conversations, they get easier with practice. They really do. We host these events called Death Over Drafts, where we go into breweries and cafes and places that have kind of a more casual vibe to them. And we play the death deck and we end up getting so many curious people who come over and want to know what we're doing. And
Mm.
the majority of people have stories to share. They have thoughts to share. They don't get the opportunity to have these type of conversations. So you might think that you don't want to talk about these things, but in my experience, most people have lots to say on the topic.
Mhm.
It's just being brave enough to have the conversations.
Yeah. And showing initiative is so helpful because it's like I'm entering in this space and I'm inviting you with me. I'm not just sitting here and saying, oh, you should do this because no one likes feeling that way. And at inheritanceofhope.org, anybody can create a will for free online. It's very simple. And so I mean, everyone should have a will. If you want others in your life to do that, start by going on it and filling it out yourself. And then say, hey, I just did this. Can I come over and help you set up yours? Maybe if you're talking to an aging parent or someone. But I love that because the more you can make it about us and an invitation, I think the less defensive people will get because death brings up a lot of emotions, and the thinking through details like this can be very difficult for most of us. That invitation, not just I'm over here, I'm pointing at you to do this, is a wonderful approach.
Yeah. And I love that Inheritance of Hope has the ability to help people complete their wills for free. I mean, it's such a tremendous resource. And I think that that's a great entry point. People can use this podcast as an entry point and say,
Mm,
I was listening to this podcast and they were talking about, that it's important to have these conversations. And it got me thinking about myself and what I would want in this situation. When you are open to having conversations about end of life, there's endless opportunities through everything happening in the day-to-day world. So I encourage people to kind of open up to that idea. And the other thing that goes less noticed is that having these type of conversations really connects us. It
mhm,
deepens our relationships when we're talking about such meaty, important life and death topics, right? I hosted an event yesterday with people in LA and we were having some conversations about death and dying and I felt so connected to this 10 strangers at the end of our conversation. And if that's in your personal life, that's amazing and that's wonderful to strengthen your relationships. But even out in the world, I think it's just wonderful for humanity for us to be connected and to be talking about real things that matter. And so that's kind of the bonus of these
mhm.
conversations is that you get to strengthen relationships with other people.
Yeah, and I'll even add to that. This could be a whole nother podcast, but I have found that acknowledging mortality and having conversations around death has been one of the most freeing things. Because if it stays in the shadow and ambiguous and kind of this icky, scary thing over there, it has this power over you. But when you can look at it and say, yeah, that is coming at some point, and I don't know when, but I feel prepared to engage with it. And I'm going to live now with death in mind. Because if it's over there, we kind of put things off. That's where like the bucket list of like, one day I'll do these things. But I feel like having these conversations is like, yeah, no, I'm going to start on that because I know it's coming at some point, and I want to live a life with no regrets. I want to have this empowered posture towards my life that I'm not hiding from it. I'm ready to engage with it. It's been a very freeing thing as I've stepped into these conversations more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk about this sometimes. My dad was diagnosed with hairy cell leukemia when he was in his early 40s. And prior to that, he was a workaholic and that's what our family did together was work. And he ended up in the hospital very sick. He felt that he was dying and he made significant changes in his life. He became a much more loving and present dad and husband and um, he's still living at 73, living with leukemia for 30 years pretty much. And it has shifted him in some beautiful ways. And so I fully believe in mortality awareness when we hold on to that our time on earth is finite, that we can make decisions about how we want to spend that time with more intention
Mhm.
and lead happier lives.
Yeah, wow, there's so much to be said for it. So that's just a small taste and just a thought prompt to think through on your own and just kind of what that could look like if you were willing to have mortality awareness and look at it and not be in fear. I love this approach in these conversations. Thank you for walking us through these options and creative ways to start talking about end of life things. And I'll just plug the death deck. I ordered one, and a few weeks ago, my husband and I were at dinner and we just pulled it out and we started having conversations about it. And it was really interesting having something to prompt a conversation you wouldn't normally have. And it gave us some great things to talk through and think about. And um, yeah, I think a lot of people don't know where to start with this. So having those question prompts takes that emotional burden off of you. You don't have to Google, what do I need to think through about dementia or end of life? It's like, no, here's this almost gamified version of it that's a very easy entry point. So yeah, thank you, Lisa, for creating those decks and making your passion something that makes it easier for other people to talk about, and also just for sharing your wisdom here today.
Thank you, Ellie, and I am glad to have the opportunity to talk about my favorite topic, helping people talk about end of life. So thank you.